So basically, what I was thinking was, I'm going to be moving into Chapter 2 of Marx's Capital. We just did Chapter 1. Chapter 1 had 4 sections. We also did a little introduction to Marx's reasoning style. This is much shorter, this chapter, and so we're not going to be spending as much time on it, and this chapter is entitled Exchange. And here we're going to be looking at Marx's view of the development of money. In classical economy, they had their own view, the classical liberal economists of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and their view of the development of money went like this. In a nutshell, you have a community, a primitive or archaic state of nature, if you will, where each member of the community specializes in the production of a certain good. You have someone who makes weapons, someone who makes clothes, someone who sells meat. Now, if I'm the person who sells weapons and I want clothes, there has to occur a double coincidence of wants by which I want their clothes and the person selling the clothes wants my weapons so that we can exchange them. Now, this is problematic because if they don't want my weapons, then an exchange can't take place. And so money is a special article, a single commodity that circumvents this problem by everybody accepting it as a universal equivalent, and so therefore a universal double coincidence of wants can always occur and we can always exchange insofar as you want the commodity being exchanged. And so that is the classical economy view of how money develops. Marx's view that we are going to get into is quite similar, but it does differ in some certain points. But what we will notice is that actually in Marx's conceptual foundations, he doesn't stray that far from the classical economists, from classical liberalism, from the bourgeois economists that defended capitalism. And one of the reasons why this is because Marx's project is to show how within capitalism is the seeds of its own undoing. How through taking Smith and Ricardo and so on to their logical conclusions, you get socialism. And so that is going to be a major part of the text as we move forward. But what Marx is firstly going to charge the classical economists with is that they naturalize private property. Capitalism is dependent on a certain set of social relations that historically develop out of prior social relations that aren't based on private property. But moreover, what the classical economists will say is that capitalism, private property, and free market exchange is actually the natural state of affairs. And so Marx makes the analogy that how classical bourgeois economists look to prior non-free market-oriented economies, such as those in ancient indigenous communities, in Eskimo society, in ancient India, in indigenous Australia, and so on, where they have communally owned property. They look to this in the same way that, as Marx says, the church fathers look to pre-Christian religion. Like it's a silly, nonsensical, absurd deviation from the natural order of things, which is private property. And so that's naturalization then is a technique that Marx highlights by which the prevailing ruling class in the society vindicates the social relations by which it exploits the lower classes beneath them and can convince those lower classes as well that their subjugation, their exploitation is actually in their own interests. I made a video called Why Would Corporations Go Woke, which explains this in greater detail, so I'm not going to spend heaps of time explaining it, but nonetheless, this is what the classical economist's attitude is towards their own system. It is the natural state of things. If you go talk to like a right-wing libertarian or someone who defends that system, they will say that all capitalism is people being left to their own devices. If you just took out any type of interference by social engineers and the government, what would be left over would be the voluntary exchanges that characterize free market economics. But Marx is going to say otherwise. Marx is going to say the commodity, which is the substance of all wealth in capitalism, is not natural, but it requires a set of social relations, and those social relations are private property, but more specifically, a product, in order to be a commodity and to be exchanged in a free market environment, it must be alienable. It must be able to be separated from oneself and then put on to a market to be traded. And so the first step then, in order for a product to become a commodity and then to be sold on a market, is that to the seller of that commodity, that commodity has to have no use value. Because if it did have a use value, they wouldn't be trading it. They would be keeping it and consuming it. Instead, it has to be valued for a second type of usefulness, and that usefulness will be the usefulness of exchange. So in other words, it has to be used solely for exchange. And so we see this distinction between use value and exchange value emerge, which is the basis by which a commodity can exist rather than just a product of labor. And so this state of private reciprocal independence has no existence in societies that historically have existed long before the emergence of capitalism. Rather, in those societies, like the before-mentioned ancient India or Eskimo society, indigenous Australia, in those societies, property is communally understood, and so therefore there cannot be a private individual who can alienate a commodity from himself in order to sell it, and moreover, the products of labor pertaining to that society are only valued insofar as they can be consumed. This idea of valuing something just because it can be sold or bought, just because it can be exchanged, that is totally alien to early mankind, and its development is one of the prerequisites of capitalism that the capitalist bourgeois economists fail to account for. And so Marx's tale of money is that in ancient communities, you don't have this Smithian state of nature where people are bartering weapons for clothes. Actually, barter doesn't exist because everything is owned collectively. In my old video called The Myth of Markets, we talk a bit about how in these communities you would have, for instance, like a council of elders, and all property or everything that was gathered or hunted, all the weapons that were made and so on were all brought back to a council of elders who then distributed it to people as they saw fit. And so rather, barter doesn't actually exist within a primitive, archaic community. But where it does exist, and this is Marx's account, is between communities. So it's only between communities that you get this first instance of two separate groups having commodities by which they have no use value for them, but because of their interaction with a foreign tribe or group, they can now alienate those commodities and exchange them for the foreign use values of the property and the commodities owned by the other tribe. And so this practice then of running into other groups and then alienating commodities and trading them, that becomes normalized until it infects the internal workings of the community, and then within the community you now have barter begin. But then, because, as Smith points out with the double coincidence of wants, you need to have one special artifact, one single commodity, that can not only weigh and measure the value of the commodities being traded so they can know the correct ratio by which they exchange, but also that one special article has to be tradable itself, so that there can be a double coincidence of wants occur at every exchange, and we can circumvent that problem we discussed in the beginning. Now, so what are the properties that this special article needs to have? Well, firstly, it needs to be divisible, it needs to be uniform, it needs to be fungible, and it needs to be portable. And so when we examine these four qualities, the most likely group of people to first discover money would have been nomadic peoples, because they are not rested in one single place, and rather all of the property that they own as a community must be portable so that it can travel with them. And so because it is portable, it is more easily able to be alienated from them and to be exchanged with other groups. And so this distinction between use for consumption and use for exchange value most likely is first realized by nomadic peoples, and then after that by everybody else. But moreover, that is going to be Chapter 2 on exchange. We just saw firstly how classical economists naturalize private property, and that it is not the natural state of things, but is dependent on a set of social relations. We then examined how these social relations develop, this distinction between use for consumption and use for exchange occurring, by which a private reciprocal independence of commodity owners and buyers and sellers must occur, and that this reciprocal independence has no existence in primitive society. Rather, in primitive society, everything is owned communally and collectively, but when those collectivist communities run into each other, then that is an opportunity for barter and exchange to take place, by which commodities emerge from products of labor through those products of labor being alienated and exchanged. And when this occurs, when this is normalized, it then will infect the internal workings of the community. Then that community begins its path to recognizing money as the necessity to counteract the problems that happen as the classical liberal problem and their account of money makes very clear. And so, yeah, that is chapter 2. We'll now be moving into chapter 3.